The evening air carried a bite that nobody had expected when the train finally ground to a halt somewhere deep in the Texas interior. It was late in 1943, and the war had already turned in ways that these men, exhausted and defeated, were only beginning to understand. They had been soldiers once, proud members of the Wehrmacht, some from elite units, others from regular infantry divisions that had seen action across North Africa and Europe. Now they were something else entirely, something diminished and uncertain. The boxcar doors rattled open with a metallic screech that echoed across the barren platform, and cold air rushed in to greet them like an unwelcome visitor. One by one, they stepped down onto American soil, their boots hitting the dirt with hollow thuds that seemed to mark the end of something they couldn't quite name yet. The guards waiting for them were calm, almost bored, going through motions they had clearly performed many times before. There was no hostility in their faces, but no warmth either, just the practiced efficiency of men doing a job they neither loved nor hated. The prisoners were counted, sorted, and directed toward a cluster of long wooden barracks that stretched across the compound like fingers reaching into the gathering dusk. Everything about this place felt strange and foreign to them. The landscape was flat and endless in a way that European terrain never was, the sky too big, the horizon too distant. They had crossed an ocean to get here, spent weeks in transit, and now found themselves deposited in this sprawling camp that seemed to exist in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by wire fences and guard towers that watched over them with mechanical indifference. Inside the barracks, the air smelled of fresh-cut lumber and dust. The bunks were simple wooden frames arranged in neat rows, military precision translated into carpentry, and on each bunk, folded with meticulous care, sat a blanket. These were not the heavy woolen blankets they had known in their barracks back home, not the thick grey or brown covers that soldiers had wrapped themselves in during cold German winters or frigid nights on the Eastern Front. These American blankets were light, almost thin, woven in pale colours that looked insubstantial even in the dim light filtering through the windows. The fabric had a strange quality to it, not quite cotton, not quite wool, something in between that felt foreign to hands accustomed to rougher textures. The reaction began almost immediately, starting as a low murmur and building into something louder and more derisive. Karl Weiss, a lieutenant who had served with the Afrika Korps before being captured in Tunisia, was among the first to lift one of the blankets and hold it up to the light. He was a tall man with angular features weathered by desert sun and North African sand, and his face twisted into an expression of amused contempt as he examined the fabric. He called out to his comrades in German, his voice carrying easily across the barracks. "Look at this," he said, holding the blanket with just 2 fingers as though it might contaminate him. "This is what the Americans think will keep us warm. You could see through this if you held it to the sun. In Europe, even the newest recruits wouldn't accept such poor quality. We use rags like this for cleaning our rifles, not for covering ourselves at night." His words sparked laughter that rippled through the room, sharp and mocking, cutting through the fatigue that had settled over them during the long journey. Other prisoners picked up their own blankets, shaking them out, testing the weight in their hands, finding them wanting. Someone made a joke about using them as handkerchiefs. Another suggested they might work better as dust cloths than as bedding. The ridicule came easily, born partly from genuine disbelief and partly from a need to assert some kind of superiority in a situation where they had very little left to feel superior about. They were prisoners, defeated soldiers in an enemy land, but at least they could laugh at the inferior equipment their captors provided. Dieter Kraus, who held the rank of major and had once been responsible for quartermaster duties in a regiment stationed near Munich, joined in with the kind of authoritative tone that came from experience. He spoke of the blankets they had used back home, describing them in detail that grew more elaborate with each sentence. Our German blankets, he explained to anyone who would listen, weighed nearly 5 kilograms each when dry, even more when damp. They were woven so thick that you could barely fold them, and when you stacked 3 or 4 on a bunk, they formed a barrier against any cold that tried to seep through stone walls or wooden boards. Those were real blankets, he insisted, made by craftsmen who understood what soldiers needed. These American things, he said with a dismissive wave, are an insult. They weigh nothing. They feel like they would tear if you pulled too hard. This is what happens when a country values quantity over quality, when they try to make everything cheap and fast instead of making it properly. The comparison became a kind of competition among the men, each trying to outdo the others in describing how inadequate these American blankets were compared to what they had known. They talked about the wool blankets issued by the Wehrmacht, heavy and scratchy against the skin but undeniably warm, capable of trapping body heat even in the worst conditions. They reminisced about barracks in Bavaria where stone walls were 3 feet thick and still the cold would find its way in, and only those massive wool blankets, layered 2 or 3 deep, could provide enough warmth to sleep through a winter night. Some of them had served on the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped so low that exposed skin could freeze in minutes, and even there they had relied on their thick German blankets, sometimes wrapping themselves completely like cocoons just to survive the brutal Russian winters. Otto Rice, a sergeant with a weathered face that spoke of too many winters in too many different places, shared a story that drew nods of recognition from those around him. During manoeuvres near the Polish border, he recalled, his unit had been supplied with such an abundance of blankets that they had to transport them in wagons pulled by horses, and the weight was so great that the animals strained under the load, their hooves digging deep into muddy roads. Even with all those blankets, he added, men still froze during the night watches. But at least they had proper wool, proper protection. Not this, he said, flicking the American blanket with his fingers in a gesture of contempt. This is what you give to beggars, not to soldiers. The mockery continued as they settled onto their bunks, arranging what few possessions they had been allowed to keep. The laughter had a brittle quality to it, a forced cheerfulness that covered deeper anxieties they didn't want to acknowledge. They were prisoners of war in a foreign country, thousands of miles from home, uncertain about their futures and the futures of their families back in Germany. The cities they had left behind were being bombed into rubble. The armies they had served were retreating on multiple fronts. Everything they had believed about German invincibility was crumbling, but here, in this moment, they could at least feel superior about something as simple as blankets. It was a small victory, a tiny assertion of pride in a situation that had stripped them of almost everything else. Outside the barracks, the sky was darkening rapidly, that peculiar quality of light that comes just before full night settles in. The guards had finished their rounds, checking that all the prisoners were accounted for, that the doors were secured, that everything was in order. They moved with practiced efficiency, these American soldiers, neither cruel nor kind, just doing their jobs with the same steady professionalism that characterized everything about this camp. When they handed out the blankets, they had shown no interest in whether the prisoners liked them or found them adequate. They simply distributed what the Quartermaster Corps had provided, marked it off on their lists, and moved on to the next task. The system ran smoothly here, like a machine that had been oiled and tested until every part worked in harmony with every other part. What none of the prisoners realized as they continued their jokes and comparisons was that something was already changing outside their wooden walls. A weather system was moving down from the northern plains, one of those late autumn cold fronts that can transform the landscape overnight. The temperature was dropping steadily, degree by degree, the kind of cold that penetrates everything, that finds every crack and crevice and pushes through with relentless determination. Texas wasn't supposed to get this cold, not usually, but weather has never cared much about what is supposed to happen. The wind was picking up too, gathering strength as it swept across hundreds of miles of open prairie, and by the time it reached the camp, it would be howling like something alive and angry. In the barracks, the men were still talking, though the conversation had shifted to other topics now. Some discussed their capture, the circumstances that had brought them here, the battles they had lost. Others spoke of home, of families they hadn't seen in months or years, of cities and towns that might no longer exist in the forms they remembered. A few wrote letters they would be allowed to send through the Red Cross, carefully worded messages that would be censored but might still carry some comfort to those waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. The thin American blankets lay forgotten on the bunks, dismissed as unimportant, barely worth the mockery they had inspired. Carl Weiss found himself thinking about the desert, about the heat of North Africa, where he had spent the last year of his service before being captured. The irony struck him as almost funny. He had survived the scorching days when the sun turned metal too hot to touch, when water was more precious than ammunition, when men died from heat and thirst as often as from enemy bullets, and now here he was in Texas, worried about cold. The war had taken him from one extreme to another, from burning sand to this strange American prairie where the temperature could apparently plummet without warning. He pulled the thin blanket over his legs, more out of habit than any real belief it would help, and tried to settle in for the night. The first hour after lights out passed in relative quiet. Men shifted on their bunks, trying to find comfortable positions on the hard wooden slats. The barracks creaked and groaned as the temperature continued to drop, wood contracting in the cold. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered in his sleep. The sounds were familiar, the same sounds you would hear in any military barracks anywhere in the world, that particular mixture of human noise and structural settling that becomes a kind of music after you've spent enough time in such places. But gradually, subtly, something new entered the mix. The wind outside was no longer just a breeze, but something stronger, pushing against the walls with increasing force, finding every gap in the construction and whistling through in thin, cold streams. By midnight, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the cold was no longer something abstract or theoretical, but a physical presence in the room. It crept in through the floorboards, rose up from the ground beneath them. It pressed against the windows and squeezed through the frames. It settled over everything like an invisible blanket, far heavier than anything made of wool or cotton. Men who had been sleeping fitfully began to wake, pulling their covers tighter, curling into themselves, seeking warmth that seemed to be draining away into the darkness. The mockery of earlier felt very distant now, replaced by a more immediate concern about basic survival. Weiss was awake, his breath visible in the faint light that filtered in from the guard posts outside. He could feel the cold pressing against him from all sides, seeping through his clothes, through the mattress beneath him. He had experienced cold before, plenty of times, but there was something particularly insidious about this cold, the way it seemed to find every exposed bit of skin, every thin spot in his defences. Almost without thinking, he pulled the American blanket up to his chin, wrapping it around his shoulders, tucking the edges under his body to seal in whatever warmth he could generate. And then something unexpected happened. The blanket, that thin, mocked, dismissed piece of fabric, began to do exactly what it was designed to do. It trapped his body heat, held it close, created a microclimate between the fabric and his skin that was noticeably warmer than the air around him. He pressed his palm flat against the blanket, feeling the texture of the weave, and noticed that the side against his body was distinctly warm, while the outer side remained cool. Somehow, impossibly, this thin cloth was holding heat more efficiently than he would have thought possible. He wanted to dismiss it as temporary, as an illusion, but the evidence was undeniable. He was warmer with this blanket than he had been without it, warmer than he had any right to be given how thin the fabric appeared. A German word slipped from his lips, barely audible, an acknowledgement of surprise that he immediately wished he could take back. But there was no one to hear it except the darkness and the cold, and neither of them cared about his pride. Across the aisle from Weiss, Otto Reis was having his own reckoning with reality. He had wrapped the American blanket around himself completely, tucking the edges under his shoulders and feet, creating a kind of cocoon. Hours earlier, he had sworn he would rather freeze than admit these blankets had any value, but survival has a way of cutting through pride with ruthless efficiency. The blanket was thin, yes, far thinner than any he had used before, but it was doing its job. His body heat, trapped inside this cocoon, was warming the small space he occupied, and as long as he stayed still and kept the blanket sealed around him, that warmth remained. His teeth had stopped chattering. The shivering that had started an hour ago was subsiding. In the faint light from outside, his eyes betrayed an expression that was equal parts relief and confusion, as though he couldn't quite reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had expected. At the far end of the barracks, a younger prisoner named Hans Keller was in trouble. He was only 20 years old, barely more than a boy, really, drafted into service before he had finished growing into his full height and strength. The cold had hit him harder than the older men, and his lungs, weakened by a respiratory infection he had picked up during transport, were struggling. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale sounding wet and laboured. The coughing started deep in his chest and worked its way up, violent spasms that shook his whole body. 2 men from nearby bunks heard him and moved closer without discussion, driven by an instinct that transcended nationality or allegiance. They pressed their bodies against his, sharing their warmth, and pulled their American blankets over all 3 of them, creating a larger pocket of trapped heat. Gradually, slowly, Keller's breathing began to stabilize. The coughing subsided to occasional spasms rather than continuous attacks. The 3 men lay there in the darkness, strangers brought together by circumstance, kept alive by fabric they had scorned. The night wore on with agonizing slowness. Every hour felt like 3, time stretching and distorting the way it does when you're cold and uncomfortable and desperately wanting morning to come. The wind outside grew louder, battering against the barracks with a fury that seemed personal. It screamed through the gaps in the walls, creating drafts that moved through the room like invisible fingers, probing and searching. The temperature continued to fall, dropping to levels that the local guards said they hadn't seen in November for almost a decade. This was unusual cold, even for Texas, a freak weather event that had caught everyone by surprise. Under normal circumstances, the barracks would have been adequate shelter, but these were not normal circumstances, and adequate shelter was barely enough. Men shifted constantly on their bunks, trying to find positions that would minimize exposure to the cold. Some pulled their blankets over their heads, breathing into the fabric to create pockets of warm air. Others curled into tight balls, making themselves as small as possible to conserve heat. A few got up and moved around, doing small exercises to keep their blood flowing, though the guards outside would occasionally bark at them to settle down and get back to bed. The American soldiers on duty were cold too, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands, but they had heavier coats and access to braziers where they could warm themselves during their shifts. The prisoners had only the clothes they wore and the blankets they had been given, and for many of them it was barely sufficient. Kraus, the major who had spoken so confidently about German wool and German quality, lay in his bunk wrapped in his American blanket and felt his certainties beginning to crack. He had fought in Poland and France, had survived the chaos of the early war years when everything seemed possible and victory seemed certain. He had believed in the system, in the hierarchy, in the idea that German engineering and German discipline represented the pinnacle of human achievement. And here he was, kept alive by a cheap American blanket that weighed almost nothing and looked like it might fall apart if you washed it too roughly. The cognitive dissonance was painful, like trying to hold 2 contradictory thoughts in his mind at the same time. How could something so flimsy work so well? How could the enemy they had dismissed as soft and unprepared produce something that actually functioned better than what his own country had made? By the time the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the windows, the barracks smelled of bodies and sweat and damp wood, that particular odour of too many men in too small a space without enough ventilation. But every man in that room was alive. Nobody had frozen to death. Nobody had succumbed to the cold. They were uncomfortable, exhausted, some of them sick, but they had survived the night. Outside, frost covered everything like a white shroud, coating the ground and the fences and the guard towers in crystalline patterns that caught the early light and threw it back in tiny sparkles. The temperature was still well below freezing, though the wind had finally died down to something more manageable. The guards who had worked through the night looked haggard and relieved as their replacements arrived, fresh men who brought coffee and complaints about how cold it had been even indoors. Inside the barracks, men began to stir, sitting up slowly, rubbing their faces, trying to work, feeling back into fingers and toes that had gone numb during the night. The blankets that had covered them were damp with condensation from their breath and their sweat, but they were intact, unbroken, still functional. Nobody said anything at first. The silence was heavy with implications, with realizations that nobody quite wanted to voice. The mockery of the previous evening hung in the air like smoke, embarrassing now in retrospect. They had laughed at these blankets, dismissed them as worthless, and then spent the night clinging to them like lifelines, which was exactly what they had been. Weiss sat on the edge of his bunk, the American blanket still draped over his shoulders, and stared at the floor. His body ached from the tension of trying to stay warm, but he was alive, and that was more than he had been certain of around 3 in the morning when the cold had been at its worst. He could feel the weight of the other men's gazes, though nobody was looking directly at anyone else. They were all processing the same experience, coming to the same conclusions, dealing with the same uncomfortable truth. The thing they had scorned had saved them, and there was no way to deny it or explain it away. An American captain made his rounds later that morning, checking on the prisoners, making sure nobody needed medical attention. His name was Walter Mills, and he had been overseeing supply distribution for the camp since it had opened. He was a practical man, not given to unnecessary conversation, but when one of the guards mentioned that the prisoners had been making fun of the blankets the day before, Mills paused and allowed himself a thin smile. He explained in simple terms that the guards might repeat to anyone who asked that these weren't traditional wool blankets at all, but a synthetic blend, materials that had been developed in American laboratories and perfected in American factories specifically for military use. Rayon and other fibers, he said, woven in patterns that maximized heat retention while minimizing weight and cost. The whole point was to make something that could be produced quickly and in enormous quantities without sacrificing functionality. He mentioned numbers that seemed impossible to the guards who heard them. One factory in Massachusetts, he said, was churning out more than 250,000 of these blankets every single month, working around the clock, 3 shifts a day. And that was just one factory. There were dozens more across the country, all producing supplies for the military effort, all running at maximum capacity. The logistics involved in moving all these materials, distributing them to bases and camps and frontline units scattered across the globe, was staggering in its complexity. Trains carried millions of blankets from factories to warehouses, from warehouses to ports, from ports to ships that crossed oceans. The whole system worked with a kind of mechanical precision that seemed almost inhuman in its efficiency. When this information filtered back to the German prisoners, it hit them with the force of revelation. Hundreds of thousands each month, Krauss repeated to himself, trying to comprehend the scale. In Germany, even before the war had started draining resources, even during the best years, their textile industry had never approached anything like that level of production. Wool had to be gathered from sheep, processed, spun, woven, dyed, cut, sewn. It was a slow process that required skilled workers and couldn't easily be rushed. And now, with the war consuming everything, Germany was rationing fabric, taking wool from civilian coats to make uniforms for soldiers at the front, recycling old blankets into new ones because they simply couldn't produce enough to meet demand. The contrast was brutal and impossible to ignore. Here in this enemy camp, prisoners were being given blankets that were not only functional, but so abundant that they could afford to hand them out to captured soldiers without a second thought. One prisoner, whose name has been lost to history, but whose words were preserved in a notebook later confiscated by guards, wrote something that captured the essence of what many were feeling. If they can afford to clothe their prisoners so generously, he wrote in cramped handwriting that suggested he was trying to hide what he was doing, then what must they be giving to their own soldiers? What kind of resources do they have that we haven't even imagined? The questions haunted him and others like him because they pointed to a truth that contradicted everything they had been told, everything they had believed about American weakness and European superiority. Stories and anecdotes began to circulate through the camp, small details that added up to a larger picture. One corporal claimed he had seen a train passing by loaded with nothing but crates of blankets, hundreds of crates stacked on flat cars, all heading west toward another camp or another base. Another overheard guards talking about how American families were donating quilts through the Red Cross, thousands of them arriving every month, sewn by women who wanted to help the war effort and support soldiers overseas. The image of housewives sitting at quilting frames, stitching together pieces of fabric to send to men they would never meet, was almost incomprehensible to prisoners who came from cities where every scrap of cloth was precious, where curtains were being torn down to make clothes because nothing new was available in the shops. The abundance was overwhelming, almost grotesque in its scale. It spoke to an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany had achieved, a system that could produce not just weapons and ammunition, but all the mundane necessities of military life, the boots and belts and blankets and bandages, in quantities that seemed limitless. And it wasn't just the quantity, but the quality that unsettled them. These blankets worked. They were well designed, carefully engineered to do exactly what they were supposed to do. This wasn't shoddy mass production or corner cutting to save money. This was innovation applied to the most basic level of soldier welfare, treating something as simple as staying warm as a problem worth solving properly. As the day progressed, the prisoners moved through their routines with a new kind of quietness. Roll call was held in the cold morning air, men standing in formation while their numbers were counted and recorded. Breakfast was distributed, simple food but adequate, more than adequate really, another reminder of the enemy's capacity to provide. Work details were assigned, though the cold made everything slower and harder. Through it all, the memory of the previous night lingered, impossible to shake or forget. Many avoided making eye contact with each other, as though afraid that acknowledging what had happened would make it too real, would force them to confront implications they weren't ready to face. The blanket had stopped being just an object. It had become a symbol, a physical representation of ideas and realities that were difficult to process. Every time they looked at it, folded on their bunks or draped over a chair, they were reminded that their assumptions had been wrong, that their arrogance had been misplaced, that the world was more complicated than the propaganda had suggested. Some tried to rationalize it away, insisting that this was a fluke, an exception, that one good blanket didn't prove anything about American superiority. But the rationalization rang hollow, even to those who voiced it, because they knew, deep down, that this wasn't about one blanket, but about the system that had produced millions of them, about the society that could afford to be generous even to its enemies. The second night came too quickly, the sun setting earlier now as autumn progressed toward winter. The weather forecast, relayed by guards who had access to radio reports, predicted that the cold would continue for at least another week, possibly longer. The temperature would remain below freezing at night, possibly dropping even lower than it had the previous evening. The prisoners filed back into their barracks with none of the swagger or confidence they had shown 24 hours earlier. This time there was no laughter, no mockery, no jokes about the thin American blankets. Instead, there was a kind of grim determination, a shared understanding that they were in for another difficult night, and that the only thing standing between them and potentially fatal cold was the same fabric they had ridiculed. Weiss climbed onto his bunk and picked up his blanket, holding it in his hands and studying it as though seeing it for the first time. The weave was intricate, tighter than it appeared at first glance. The fibres had a slight sheen to them, catching the light in ways that wool never did. It felt different from anything he had touched before, synthetic in a way that was neither good nor bad, but simply other, a product of a different approach to manufacturing, a different philosophy about what materials could do. He wrapped it around himself carefully, tucking the edges just as he had learned to do the night before, creating that crucial seal that would trap his body heat and keep the cold at bay. As he lay back on his bunk, he whispered something into the darkness, words that none of his comrades heard, but that were nonetheless significant for being spoken. Without these blankets, he said to no one in particular, half of us would be dead already. The confession hung in the air, invisible but present. Across the room, other men were coming to similar conclusions, though few had the courage or honesty to voice them aloud. Kraus lay in his bunk, the blanket pulled up to his chin, and felt something inside him shift and crack. His pride, so carefully maintained through years of service and months of captivity, was fracturing under the weight of simple truth. He had built his identity around the idea of German superiority, around the belief that his nation's methods and materials and approaches were the best in the world. And here was this American blanket, light and thin and somehow perfect, doing its job with quiet efficiency while his assumptions crumbled around him. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any words could have been, a kind of internal surrender that nobody else could see, but that he felt in every fibre of his being. Rice pulled his blanket tight and muttered something that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. It was hard to tell which. "The thing we laughed at," he said to the man on the next bunk, "was the thing that saved us." The irony was almost too much to bear, like a joke with a punchline that cut too deep to be funny. They had been so certain, so absolutely convinced of their own superiority, and reality had proven them wrong in the most basic and undeniable way possible. Survival stripped away pretense and left only truth, and the truth was that they owed their lives to the very people they had been taught to despise and defeat. As night deepened and the temperature dropped again, the barracks became a place of whispered conversations and quiet contemplations. Some men argued that this was all part of some elaborate psychological operation, that the Americans wanted them to feel grateful and compliant, that the blankets were a tool of manipulation designed to soften their resistance and break their will. Others countered that no amount of propaganda could change the fundamental fact that they had slept through a freezing night and woken up alive, that their comfort and survival were not illusions, but concrete realities that couldn't be explained away by theories about manipulation. The debate was conducted in low voices, half-arguments that never quite reached conclusions, questions that had no easy answers. One diary entry from this period, later discovered in a collection of prisoner writings archived in Berlin after the war, revealed the depth of the internal struggle many were experiencing. "Last night," the anonymous writer recorded, "I realized that strength is not always heavy, and that salvation does not always come dressed in iron. Sometimes it is as light as cloth, as simple as thread woven by machines in a country I was taught to hate. I do not know what this means for everything I believed, but I know that I am alive, and that counts for something." The words were careful, measured, the thoughts of someone trying to reconcile contradictory truths without losing himself in the process. The question that kept circling back, that wouldn't leave them alone no matter how hard they tried to push it away, was whether to cling to their wounded pride or accept the reality of their situation. Pride was familiar, comfortable in its own painful way. It allowed them to maintain some sense of who they had been, what they had fought for, even in defeat. But reality was insistent, pressing against them with the same relentless force as the cold, refusing to be ignored or dismissed. They had been saved by enemy generosity, sheltered by enemy innovation, kept alive by a system they had been told was weak and decadent. Accepting that meant reconsidering everything, and that was a task most of them weren't sure they were ready for. Morning came again, another dawn breaking cold and clear over the frost-covered landscape. The prisoners emerged from their barracks looking haggard but alive, shoulders still hunched against the cold but bodies intact. On the parade ground, guards distributed another round of blankets, extras to replace any that had gotten too damp or torn, and because the weather forecast suggested the cold snap would last longer than anyone had initially expected. The distribution was matter-of-fact, bureaucratic, guards checking names against lists and handing out supplies with the same efficiency they brought to every task. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of what these blankets represented or what they meant to the men receiving them. An American sergeant, a man named Thompson, who had been working at the camp since before these particular prisoners arrived, paused in his distribution when he noticed one of the younger Germans coughing violently, doubled over with spasms that shook his whole body. Hans Keller looked terrible, his face pale and drawn, his lips taking on a blue tinge that suggested his circulation wasn't what it should be. Without asking permission or making a speech about it, Thompson simply draped a second blanket over the boy's shoulders, a gesture so casual and unremarkable that it might have gone unnoticed except for what it represented. There was no gloating, no demand for gratitude, no attempt to make Keller acknowledge American superiority. It was just one human being responding to another human being's obvious need, stripped of everything except basic compassion. Keller stared at the sergeant for a long moment, unable to find words in English or German that would adequately express what he was feeling. The blanket over his shoulders was warm, solid, real. The man who had given it to him was already moving on to the next prisoner, already forgetting the gesture because to him it was nothing special, just part of the job. But to Keller, it was everything. It was the moment when the enemy stopped being a faceless abstraction and became specific, individual, human. He pulled the blanket closer and felt something inside him shift, some hard shell of hatred or fear beginning to crack. Later that afternoon, a delivery wagon rattled into the camp, pulled by horses that steamed in the cold air, their breath visible as white plumes. The wagon was loaded with quilts, dozens of them, donated by townspeople from the nearest settlement. These weren't military issue, but homemade items, pieced together by church groups and women's clubs, patterns of flowers and stars and geometric shapes, each one unique. The guards unloaded them and distributed them among the prisoners, adding them to the existing blankets as extra layers against the continuing cold. Some of the quilts were clearly old, treasured items that families had used for years before deciding to donate them. Others were new, made specifically for this purpose, fabric cut and sewn with care by hands that had never seen the men who would use them. One quilt, covered in small embroidered flowers with a child's stitching visible along one edge, ended up on the bunk of a tank officer from Hamburg named Friedrich Werner. He was in his mid-30s, a career soldier who had joined the military long before the current madman had come to power, a professional who had served because it was the family tradition and because he believed in duty and honour. He picked up the quilt and examined the stitching, recognizing the uneven quality that came from young hands learning a new skill. Some American child had made this, practicing her needlework, and then her family had decided to send it here, to a camp full of enemy soldiers, trusting that it would be used to keep someone warm. The thought was almost unbearable in its simplicity and generosity. Werner traced the small flowers with his fingertip, following the thread from petal to stem to leaf, and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Shame, yes, but also wonder and confusion and a kind of grief for everything that had been lost and destroyed in this war. An American family had given warmth to a man who had fought to destroy theirs, who had served in a military machine dedicated to conquest and domination. They didn't know him, didn't know whether he was a good man or a monster, didn't know what he had done or failed to do. They had simply seen a need and responded to it, trusting in some basic human obligation that transcended nationality and ideology. He folded the quilt carefully and placed it at the foot of his bunk, unable to use it yet, unable to accept the gift without first wrestling with what it meant. That evening, the barracks filled with conversation that was different from previous nights. The tone had changed, becoming more introspective, more uncertain. Some men still insisted that this was all manipulation, that the Americans were trying to weaken their resolve and make them more compliant. But the arguments sounded hollow even to those making them, rationalizations that couldn't quite cover the obvious truth. Krauss, who had been among the loudest critics of American quality and efficiency, finally admitted something to Weiss in a voice barely above a whisper. "They could have let us freeze," he said. "They could have given us nothing, or given us blankets that barely worked, and nobody would have blamed them. We're the enemy. We came here to fight them, to defeat them, and they captured us. But instead, they saved us. I don't know how to explain that. I don't know what it means." Weiss had no answer, because he was wrestling with the same questions. The whole structure of his understanding of the war, of the sides, and who was right and who was wrong, had been built on certain assumptions about strength and weakness, about which nations deserved to win and which deserved to lose. And here was this blanket, this simple object, undermining all of it. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, the people they had been fighting weren't the corrupt and degenerate weaklings the propaganda had described. Maybe instead they were competent and innovative and, most disturbing of all, fundamentally decent in ways that made the whole war feel like a terrible mistake. The blanket had become more than fabric. It was a bridge, fragile and unexpected, between enmity and something else, something harder to name. It reminded them that war was fought between governments and armies, between ideologies and leaders, but that survival was shared between individual men who weren't really so different from each other. The guards who watched over them were just doing their jobs, just following orders, just trying to get through the war and go home, exactly like the prisoners would have been doing if circumstances had been reversed. The women who had sewn the quilts were just trying to help, to do something useful and kind in a world that had gone mad with violence. And the prisoners themselves, for all their training and ideology, were just men trying to stay warm on a cold Texas night, trying to survive long enough to see their families again, trying to make sense of a world that had stopped making sense a long time ago. As the night deepened and men settled into sleep, wrapped in their American blankets and donated quilts, a strange kind of peace settled over the barracks. It wasn't happiness, wasn't contentment, but it was something close to acceptance. They were alive, they were warm enough, and tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and they would deal with it as best they could, the same as they had dealt with everything else. Some men dreamed of home, of streets they had walked and people they had loved. Others dreamed of nothing, exhaustion pulling them into a darkness free of thought or memory. And a few lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about thin blankets and the unexpected ways that pride could be humbled. The cold snap lasted for a week, exactly as the weather forecasters had predicted, temperatures remaining below freezing every night, sometimes dropping low enough that water in the washing buckets froze solid and had to be thawed before it could be used. During those 7 days, not a single prisoner suffered serious cold-related injury. Nobody lost fingers or toes to frostbite. Nobody developed pneumonia or hypothermia severe enough to require hospitalization. The blankets, supplemented by the donated quilts and by the prisoners' own growing understanding of how to use them effectively, were sufficient. Barely sufficient in some cases, requiring careful management and strategic use of body heat, but sufficient nonetheless. The survival rate was 100%, a statistic that would have been unremarkable except that it proved beyond any possible doubt that the mocked American blankets worked exactly as designed. When the weather finally broke and temperatures began to rise back towards seasonal norms, the change was almost anticlimactic. The cold retreated, the frost melted, the wind lost its edge. Life in the camp continued its routine of roll calls and work details and meals and mail distribution. The prisoners adapted to their situation with the resilience that soldiers develop, making the best of things that couldn't be changed. But something fundamental had shifted during those cold nights. The blankets remained on their bunks, folded neatly each morning as camp regulations required, but they were no longer objects of ridicule. Some men treated them with something approaching reverence, folding them with care, smoothing out wrinkles, treating them as precious items rather than disposable supplies. Winter arrived in earnest in December, bringing temperatures that, while cold, were nothing like that early November freeze. The prisoners had learned by then how to layer their blankets, how to tuck the edges to trap heat, how to position themselves on their bunks to minimize exposure to drafts. They had become experts in the science of staying warm with minimal resources, knowledge bought through experience and necessity. When new prisoners arrived, transferred from other camps or fresh captures from the war that still raged overseas, The veterans would pass on their knowledge, teaching the newcomers how to respect the thin American blankets instead of mocking them. The lessons were taught with a kind of quiet authority that came from lived experience. By spring of 1945, the war was clearly ending, Germany collapsing under pressure from both east and west, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies in full retreat. News filtered into the camp through letters and newspapers and radio broadcasts that guards would occasionally share. The man in Berlin, the Austrian who had started it all, whose name the prisoners would sometimes whisper but rarely say aloud, was reportedly holed up in a bunker, his empire crumbling around him. His grand vision of a 1,000-year reign was ending in its 12th year, defeated not just by soldiers but by factory workers who could produce millions of blankets, by a system so robust it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. The irony was not lost on those who bothered to think about it. When Germany finally surrendered in May, the news was received in the camp with a mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the killing would stop, that the bombs would stop falling, that maybe finally they could go home. But grief too, for everything that had been lost, for the millions dead, for the cities destroyed, for the futures that would never be. The prisoners were allowed to gather in the camp yard to hear the announcement, guards standing watch but not interfering, letting the men process the news in their own ways. Some wept openly. Others stood in silence, faces blank. A few tried to maintain military bearing, standing at attention as though the discipline could somehow make sense of the senselessness. Repatriation began slowly, logistics of moving thousands of prisoners across oceans requiring time and planning. When each man's turn came, he was allowed to take minimal possessions, only what could fit in a small bag. Yet among those carefully chosen items, many men included their blankets, the thin American fabric that had kept them alive through that first terrible cold snap and through the winter that followed. They folded them neatly, tucked them into their bags, treated them with a care that spoke to meaning beyond mere utility. The guards who processed them noticed but said nothing, understanding perhaps that these blankets represented something more complex than simple warmth. Keller, the young soldier who had nearly died that first night, who had been given a second blanket by a sergeant who didn't know his name and wouldn't have cared about his ideology, carried his blanket home to Bremen. The city he returned to was not the city he had left. Whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, familiar landmarks gone, replaced by empty spaces and temporary shelters. His mother met him at the train station, older and thinner than he remembered, her face lined with worry and grief for all they had lost. He showed her the blanket, tried to explain its significance, but the words came out wrong, inadequate to capture the complexity of what he felt. "From the enemy?" she asked, her voice carrying all the hatred and fear that 6 years of war had instilled. He nodded, unable to explain that the enemy had given him more than warmth, had given him his life and, in some strange way, his humanity back. Years later, when Keller was an old man and his grandchildren would climb onto his lap asking for stories, he would pull out that same blanket, worn now and patched in places, but still intact, still functional. He would let them touch the fabric, run their small fingers over the synthetic weave, and he would try to explain what it meant, what it represented. "This," he would say, his voice soft with memory and emotion, "is not just a blanket. This is the reason I am here to tell you stories. This is the reason you exist. Without this, I would have frozen in Texas in 1943, and everything that came after, all the life I lived, all the love I experienced, all of it would never have happened. The blanket saved me, but more than that, it taught me something about strength and kindness that I needed to learn." Other former prisoners had similar stories, similar items carefully preserved through decades of peace. Werner, the tank officer from Hamburg, kept his quilt with the child's embroidery, the one that had undone something hard and closed inside him. He never used it, keeping it instead in a chest in his bedroom, taking it out occasionally to look at the flowers stitched by unknown American hands. It was, he explained to his wife when she asked why he kept it, a reminder that even in the worst times, even when humanity seemed to have failed completely, there were still people who chose kindness. Rice, the sergeant who had fought on too many fronts in too many countries, wrapped his blanket in paper and stored it in his attic, unable to look at it too often because of the complicated emotions it stirred, but unwilling to discard it because of what it represented. The blankets outlasted the war, outlasted the ideologies that had driven the conflict, outlasted many of the men who had used them. Some were passed down to children and grandchildren who might not fully understand their significance but recognized them as important family artifacts. Others ended up in museums or historical collections where visitors could see them displayed behind glass with placards explaining their history and meaning. A few were lost to time, thrown away by relatives who didn't know their importance or destroyed in fires and accidents and the ordinary entropy that claims all physical objects eventually. But the memory persisted, preserved in written accounts and oral histories, and the lingering awareness that sometimes the most important lessons come from the simplest sources. In the decades after the war, as Germany rebuilt and reconciled with its past, as historians studied the conflict from every angle and survivors processed their experiences through memoirs and interviews, the story of the blankets became a kind of parable. It was taught in schools as an example of how assumptions can be wrong, how propaganda distorts reality, how the enemy is often more complex than we want to believe. It showed up in books and documentaries, in discussions about war and peace and human nature. The thin American blanket, mocked and then treasured, became a symbol for the way that truth can emerge in unexpected forms, that wisdom sometimes comes wrapped in humility and shame. What made the story resonate was its simplicity. There were no heroes in the traditional sense, no dramatic rescues or noble sacrifices. Just men who were cold and fabric that kept them warm, and the slow realization that their certainties had been built on sand. The blanket didn't choose sides or make moral judgments. It simply did what it was designed to do, holding heat, protecting against cold, functioning exactly as its creators intended. And in that simple function, it revealed truths that no amount of argument or propaganda could convey. It showed that innovation matters, that industrial capacity matters, that systems and processes and unglamorous logistics can be as important as valor and courage and fighting spirit. The prisoners who had experienced that first freezing night never forgot it, carrying the memory like a scar that had healed but remained visible. In their telling and retelling of the story, certain details became fixed, canonical. The laughter in the barracks when they first saw the blankets, the mockery and the certainty of their own superiority, the bitter cold of that November night, the slow realization as dawn approached that the thin fabric was saving their lives, the shame and confusion and grudging respect that followed. These elements appeared in nearly every account, slight variations in specifics but consistency in the overall arc, suggesting that this was how it actually happened, that this was the truth as they remembered it. But beneath the factual recounting was something else, something harder to articulate but no less real. It was the feeling of having been fundamentally wrong about something important, of having assumptions challenged and discarded, of being forced to see the world differently than you had before. It was the uncomfortable recognition that the people you had fought and hated were, in many ways, better than you had been taught to believe, that they possessed virtues and capabilities that your own side had lacked. And perhaps most difficult of all, it was the awareness that you had survived because of enemy kindness, that your life had been preserved by the very people you had sought to destroy, and that this created a debt that could never be fully repaid, but also couldn't be ignored. When the last of the men who had experienced that night began to die, passing away in the 1990s and early 2000s, their obituaries would sometimes mention the blanket story, if the writers knew about it and understood its significance. Family members would remember hearing about it, about the thin American fabric that had saved a life and changed a perspective. The blankets themselves, those that had been preserved, became more valuable, not monetarily but historically, as primary artifacts from a specific time and place, touchstones that connected the present to a past that was rapidly fading from living memory into history. And so the story persisted, passed from generation to generation, adapted and retold and interpreted through different lenses. Sometimes it was used to make points about American industrial might, about the arsenal of democracy and the power of mass production. Other times it served as a meditation on humility and the dangers of arrogance, a cautionary tale about assuming superiority without evidence. Still, others saw in it a story about basic human decency, about the choice to care for others even when they are designated as enemies, about the small acts of kindness that can change lives and perspectives. All these interpretations had merit. All contained some truth because the story was big enough and complex enough to support multiple meanings without being reduced to any single message. The blanket, in the end, was just a blanket, woven fibre designed to trap heat and provide comfort. But it was also more than that, a catalyst for revelation, a teacher that instructed through direct experience rather than words. It had no agenda, no ideology, no purpose beyond its function. And perhaps that was its power, that it simply was what it was, and in being fully and completely itself, it revealed truths that had been hidden by assumptions and prejudices, and the lies that people tell themselves to justify their actions and beliefs. In a war full of complexity and moral ambiguity, the blanket offered something rare and precious, a moment of absolute clarity where right and wrong, effective and ineffective could be measured not by rhetoric but by result, where survival itself became the ultimate argument. History remembers the big moments, the battles that shifted the course of the war, the decisions that determined the fate of nations, the speeches that inspired millions. And those things matter, certainly. They shape the world in ways that can't be ignored. But history is also made in smaller moments, in barracks at night where cold seeps through walls and men huddle under thin blankets wondering if they'll survive until morning. It's made in the quiet gesture of a sergeant draping extra fabric over shivering shoulders, in the decision of a family to donate a quilt to strangers who might be enemies, in the slow realization that what you believed so absolutely was wrong. These moments don't make headlines or change the outcome of battles, but they change the people who experience them, and those changed people carry their new understanding forward into whatever future they are allowed to have. The German prisoners who slept under American blankets in a Texas camp in 1943 learned something that no amount of propaganda or ideology could teach them. They learned that strength can be light as well as heavy, that innovation can matter as much as tradition, that the enemy is rarely what you expect them to be. But most of all, they learned that survival sometimes requires you to accept help from unexpected places, to admit that you were wrong, to acknowledge that others might know things you don't. It was a hard lesson, bought at the price of pride and certainty, but it was also a necessary one, the kind of knowledge that comes only through direct experience and can't be explained to those who haven't lived it. And so the story of the blanket endures, passed down through time, a small chapter in a vast war, a footnote in histories that focus on larger events. But for those who were there, for those who shivered through that first freezing night and woke to find themselves alive when they might easily have been dead, it was never small or insignificant. It was everything. It was the moment when the world shifted, when understanding broke through illusion, when a thin piece of fabric became the most important thing in the world because it stood between life and death, between truth and lies, between the past and whatever future would follow.